Hollywood's golden age looked flawless from the outside. Bright lights, perfect smiles, legends who seemed larger than life. But behind the velvet curtains, Dan Blocker discovered something far darker. Many of those beloved icons carried a quiet, hidden prejudice that shaped the industry from the shadows. How could the people praised as symbols of elegance, kindness, activism, and artistic genius also draw invisible lines between who belonged and who didn't? Why did some stars preach equality on stage, yet behave differently when the camera stopped rolling? Why did others enforce aesthetic standards that conveniently erased artists of color? And why did so many insiders accept this as normal? But the biggest question of all is this: what compelled Dan Blocker, the gentle giant of Bonanza, to finally break the silence and reveal what he had seen behind closed doors? Because the truth isn't loud. It doesn't always show itself in shouting or scandal. Sometimes it hides in polite refusals, backstage preferences, and decisions that shaped careers without anyone noticing. Stay with us as we uncover 10 Hollywood legends whose private actions painted a very different picture from the heroic images the world adored. And the first name will shock you. Audrey Hepburn has long been protected by an almost mythological aura. Few stars in Hollywood's golden age managed to build an image as immaculate as hers, the embodiment of grace, elegance, and kindness. Even people who never watched her films still recognize her as a symbol of purity, a gentle presence untouched by the cynicism around her. That carefully crafted image, preserved across decades of photographs and humanitarian work, made the whispers Dan Blocker heard behind the scenes all the more jarring. They did not describe a cruel woman, nor someone fueled by resentment. Instead, they painted a subtler, quieter picture, one shaped by preferences and decisions that seemed harmless on the surface, but revealed an invisible line she rarely crossed. During early discussions for My Fair Lady, the studio briefly considered collaborating with a young black choreographer whose talent was beginning to attract attention. The idea disappeared almost as quickly as it was proposed. A short, informal studio note that Blocker saw circulating backstage stated that Hepburn felt the choice did not match the visual tone she envisioned. It was not an accusation nor an insult, simply a polished rejection that effectively closed the door on an artist whose career could have changed from that opportunity alone. People who worked with her insisted she never expressed hostility, yet many recalled similar patterns, decisions shaped by an aesthetic ideal that, intentionally or not, excluded performers of color. Years later, UNICEF volunteers who collaborated with Hepburn described her as dedicated and genuinely compassionate. Yet even they remembered moments when she asked whether certain campaign images were too harsh or not harmonious enough. Comments that occasionally resulted in softer, more uniform visuals. Privately, some staff wondered whether those suggestions reflected standard artistic judgment or a discomfort with images that disrupted the refined narrative associated with her brand. None of them accused her of ill intent, but even good intentions can cast shadows when the same types of images are repeatedly adjusted or removed. Blocker was struck not by malice, but by the silence surrounding these choices. No one questioned them because Audrey Hepburn was simply Audrey Hepburn, an icon whose gentleness made scrutiny feel almost inappropriate. He later said that sometimes the most powerful boundaries are drawn without a single harsh word, and that in Hollywood, the quietest exclusions were often the hardest to confront. Marlon Brando's public persona has always been tied to rebellion, moral courage, and an almost legendary willingness to confront injustice. When he refused his Oscar and sent Sachin Littlefeather to speak about the mistreatment of Native Americans, the world applauded him as a fearless activist who used his fame for a higher purpose. To this day, many view him as the rare celebrity who stood on the right side of history long before the rest of Hollywood dared to follow. But the stories Dan Blocker heard in quieter corners of the industry painted a far more complex figure, one whose commitment to justice seemed to fluctuate depending on whether anyone was watching. Blocker attended several private gatherings where Brando's behavior diverged sharply from the fiery convictions he displayed in interviews. According to colleagues who knew Brando well, he often spoke passionately about civil rights when reporters were present, yet drifted into indifference when the room held only peers. At one industry event, a producer recalled that Brando declined to participate in a televised panel on social equality, not because he disagreed with its message, but because he felt, in his words, that the moment wasn't right for visibility. The phrasing was vague, but to many who overheard, it suggested that Brando's activism sometimes aligned more closely with performance than principle. Blocker also heard about an instance during a charity program where Brando was invited to collaborate with a group of emerging black actors. Several attendees remembered his reaction as distant rather than engaged, offering polite encouragement, yet choosing not to attend rehearsal sessions or workshops that required more than a symbolic presence. No one claimed he was openly dismissive, but the contrast between his public statements and private participation left many questioning how deep his commitment truly ran. For Blocker, Brando represented a form of selective activism that Hollywood rarely acknowledged, support that flared brightly under the spotlight but dimmed in the absence of applause. He once remarked that Brando was capable of extraordinary generosity and conviction, yet at times seemed more devoted to the image of a revolutionary than to the difficult, unglamorous work that real change demanded. Brando was not a villain, Blocker believed, but a man divided between genuine idealism and the comfort of performing virtue in front of an admiring world. John Wayne's image has always carried a weight that few Hollywood stars could match. To generations of Americans, he symbolized rugged strength, unwavering patriotism, and a distinctly masculine moral code. His screen presence shaped not only the Western genre, but the national identity itself. Yet for all the admiration aimed in his direction, conversations inside studio hallways told a different story, one that Dan Blocker heard repeatedly from people who had worked near Wayne during the turbulent 1960s. Unlike some stars whose biases hid behind polite gestures or coded language, Wayne's were expressed through a firm, unapologetic worldview that seldom softened, even in private. Blocker recalled speaking with a veteran reporter who had interviewed Wayne several times during the height of the civil rights movement. The journalist described Wayne as courteous but unyielding, someone who believed, with complete sincerity, that America risked losing its foundation if it embraced social change too quickly. During one off-the-record conversation, Wayne reportedly remarked that the country needs steadiness, not upheaval, a sentiment that echoed through many of his later political statements. He was not hostile, the reporter explained, but deeply committed to an older vision of America that left little room for perspectives outside the one he had grown up with. Crew members from several of Wayne's productions also told Blocker that the actor preferred working environments that reflected his personal values, which often meant resisting casting adjustments intended to bring more diversity into supporting roles. These were not loud objections, rather they were subtle pressures, comments made during rehearsals, quiet suggestions to producers, and an unmistakable expectation that films should align with a traditional, monolithic image of American heroism. In an era when Hollywood was slowly beginning to change, such expectations carried significant influence. Blocker believed Wayne's stance did not stem from cruelty, but from a profound attachment to the past, an attachment so strong that it created barriers he never fully recognized. To Blocker, Wayne embodied the version of Hollywood that refused to evolve, proud, towering, and unwavering, yet blind to the ways its steadfastness kept others at a permanent distance. Wayne may not have intended harm, but his presence, both on-screen and off, reinforced a system where only certain kinds of heroes were allowed to stand in the spotlight. As Hollywood moved from its rugged Western icons to the glittering world of musicals and technicolor dreams, Judy Garland seemed to represent everything the industry wanted the public to believe in: vulnerability, charm, and a kind of aching sincerity that made audiences feel protective of her. She was the opposite of John Wayne's stoic certainty. She embodied fragility in a world built on illusion. Yet, the deeper Dan Blocker ventured into the memories of those who had worked alongside her, the more he realized that even the most delicate stars could cast shadows that surprised the people standing closest to them. Former MGM dancers described Garland as intensely committed to the visual rhythm of every number, especially during the production of The Harvey Girls. According to several recounts, she became quietly tense whenever the ensemble's spacing felt off balance. One dancer recalled a moment when a black performer accidentally brushed against the fringe of her costume during rehearsal. Garland didn't lash out or complain openly, but she paused, exchanged a subtle look with the choreographer, and suggested reorganizing the formation to keep the staging clean. The words were soft, almost considerate, yet the outcome was unmistakable. Certain performers were shifted aside without further explanation. Blocker later heard a similar story from a venue manager involved in her concert tours. Garland cared deeply about how the audience appeared from the stage and on camera, often requesting adjustments to the seating plan to create what she called a more harmonious front row. The manager admitted that Garland never stated a discriminatory reason, but the pattern left him wondering whether her aesthetic preferences reflected assumptions she herself never fully questioned. To Blocker, these accounts revealed a more complex truth about Garland. She was not cruel, nor did she wield her power with deliberate malice. Instead, her deep insecurities and lifelong need for control sometimes manifested as quiet forms of exclusion. Subtle shifts in tone, gentle suggestions, or aesthetic concerns that carried unintended consequences. Blocker described her as a woman so accustomed to managing her own chaos that she managed everyone else's without realizing where the boundaries were. In his eyes, Garland's shadow did not come from anger, but from the unexamined habits of a star whose fragility both endeared her to the world and complicated the lives of those around her. As Blocker listened to stories that blurred the line between intention and impact, the next name surprised him not because of scandal, but because of how profoundly it challenged the image the world still holds. Paul Newman, with his famously disarming blue eyes and reputation as one of Hollywood's most generous spirits, seemed like the last person anyone would expect to appear on such a list. Yet the accounts Blocker encountered painted a portrait not of a hypocrite, but of a man whose progressive ideals sometimes collided with the quieter prejudices he may never have recognized within himself. Newman's charitable work was real, and his public support for social justice inspired many. However, colleagues who exchanged letters with him during the 1960s remembered moments when his optimism faltered. In private correspondence, Newman occasionally expressed concern that rapid integration in schools and neighborhoods might cause social instability, a phrase shaped as much by the fears of the era as by his own experiences growing up in a predominantly white, insulated world. These were not statements of exclusion, but reflections of someone wrestling with change he supported in theory, yet found unsettling in practice. Blocker also heard from a crew member in Newman's racing circle who recalled discussions about the team's public image. Newman prided himself on discipline and uniformity, valuing consistency above all else. According to this crew member, Newman sometimes hesitated to bring in drivers from backgrounds he felt might distract from the team's identity. Though the reasoning was framed in terms of branding, the implication lingered, leaving some to wonder whether deeper assumptions lay beneath those decisions. What struck Blocker most was not contradiction, but complexity. Newman was capable of extraordinary kindness, donating millions, championing the underdog, and using his fame for causes larger than himself. Yet he also carried the quiet biases of someone shaped by a country grappling with its own identity. Blocker believed Newman's struggle reflected a truth few celebrities dared admit. Even the most well-intentioned individuals can unintentionally reinforce boundaries they believe they are fighting to dismantle. In Blocker's view, Newman was a reminder that prejudice is not always loud or deliberate. Sometimes it hides in hesitation and the desire to protect an established image, or in the fear that change might move faster than one's comfort. And that, Blocker felt, made his story as important as any other on this list. As Blocker continued piecing together the quiet contradictions of Hollywood's brightest names, he found himself confronting a figure whose reputation for social awareness had long been woven into his legacy. Frank Sinatra, smooth, confident, effortlessly charismatic, was celebrated not just for his voice, but for his willingness to stand beside black artists at a time when many stars refused to take such visible stances. On stage and in interviews, Sinatra projected the image of a man unafraid to challenge prejudice. Yet the stories Blocker heard from performers and staff behind the neon lights of Las Vegas suggested that even the most progressive public faces carried contradictions the world never saw. Several musicians who worked the casino circuit during the 1950s and early 1960s told Blocker that Sinatra's support, while genuine in many ways, was not always as unwavering behind closed doors. Though he openly opposed discriminatory policies at certain venues, there were nights when long-standing segregation practices remained untouched, not because Sinatra endorsed them, but because he chose not to confront management when cameras weren't present. A lounge singer recalled an evening when he expected Sinatra to intervene after black performers were asked to enter through a service entrance. Instead, Sinatra brushed past the issue with a diplomatic shrug, explaining quietly that fighting every battle isn't good strategy. The comment lingered, leaving many unsure where conviction ended and convenience began. Another account came from a veteran photographer who described Sinatra as both generous and intensely particular. According to him, Sinatra could be warm one moment and sharply dismissive the next, especially when he felt a photograph captured him at an unflattering angle. On one occasion, the photographer believed Sinatra's irritation was directed not at the picture itself, but at the young black assistant who handed him the proof sheet. The assistant insisted Sinatra said nothing overt, yet the tension in the room was unmistakable, a subtle shift in tone that revealed a boundary no one dared probe. What troubled Blocker was not the presence of malice, but the inconsistency. Sinatra undeniably opened doors for many marginalized performers, yet he sometimes allowed the old rules to stand unchallenged when silence offered smoother passage. To Blocker, this duality reflected a truth Hollywood rarely acknowledged. Even those who walk toward progress do not always walk the entire distance. Sinatra's legacy, he believed, was not tarnished by these moments, but made more human. An icon wrestling with the weight of his power, the demands of his image, and the uncomfortable gap between public ideals and private choices. Moving deeper into the stories whispered through old studio corridors, Blocker reached a name that startled him, not because of overt hostility, but because of the quiet contradiction between the man's on-screen persona and his real-life discomfort with the changing world around him. Steve McQueen, Hollywood's king of cool, projected an effortless rebellion that inspired an entire generation. He played men who outsmarted systems, broke rules, and chased freedom with a defiant grin. Yet, according to those who worked near him during the 1960s, McQueen's appetite for rebellion rarely extended to social movements he did not personally control. A director who collaborated with him during The Great Escape recalled that when discussions arose about expanding the background cast to better reflect the racial diversity of real wartime prison camps, McQueen expressed reservations framed in the language of authenticity. He argued that audiences expected a certain visual consistency and cautioned that too many changes might distract from the film's tone. His comments were polite and measured, but they carried enough influence to halt the proposal entirely. Crew members later confided to Blocker that McQueen seemed uneasy whenever conversations touched on civil rights topics, as if cultural shifts happening outside the studio walls threatened the carefully curated world in which he felt safe. Blocker also heard from a longtime acquaintance in McQueen's social circle who remembered gatherings where political debates grew tense. While McQueen avoided inflammatory language, he often aligned himself with friends who viewed the civil rights movement with suspicion, questioning its methods rather than its goals. According to this acquaintance, McQueen worried that too much change happening too quickly would unsettle the industry and destabilize the masculine archetype he had built his career upon. His hesitations were quieter than those of more outspoken conservatives, yet they revealed a man navigating fame while holding tightly to the world that had elevated him. To Blocker, McQueen represented a different kind of resistance, one rooted not in anger but in fear of losing a familiar identity. He believed McQueen never intended harm. Instead, he struggled with a shifting cultural landscape that challenged the foundations of his stardom. In Blocker's words, Steve fought every authority but the one that asked him to share the stage. It was a reminder that even Hollywood's boldest rebels sometimes feared the revolutions that didn't begin with them. From the smoky lounges of Las Vegas to the controlled chaos of action sets, Blocker found many shades of contradiction in Hollywood's leading men. Yet few embodied that complexity as starkly as Charlton Heston. On screen, Heston towered like a myth. Moses parting the sea, Judah Ben-Hur defying tyranny. Figures shaped from pure moral resolve. His characters fought for justice with an intensity that felt almost spiritual. But among writers, producers, and political organizers who worked beside him, Blocker encountered a more conflicted man, one whose ideals shifted as the nation around him transformed. During the early 1960s, Heston famously marched in support of civil rights, a gesture many in Hollywood admired. But as the decade progressed and debates over integration and social reform grew more polarized, Heston's stance became less predictable. A screenwriter who collaborated with him on a historical epic recalled that Heston sometimes pushed back against scripts giving prominent roles to black actors in positions of equal narrative weight. The actor rarely stated his objections directly. Instead, he would comment that certain characters interrupted the story's balance or did not reflect the film's tone. His feedback was always framed in professional terms, yet the adjustments that followed routinely diminished opportunities for performers of color. Blocker also heard from political aides who worked on campaigns Heston supported in the 1970s. They described a man deeply concerned with societal stability, increasingly drawn to conservative candidates who promised order amid cultural upheaval. Though Heston never renounced his earlier activism, his later alliances, particularly with groups wary of rapid social change, created friction within Hollywood's progressive circles. Some believed he had grown more rigid. Others felt he simply struggled to reconcile his heroic self-image with a world whose definitions of heroism were shifting. For Blocker, Heston was not a villain, but a symbol of a generation caught between eras. Someone who wanted to stand for righteousness, yet hesitated when righteousness required relinquishing familiar hierarchies. Blocker once reflected that Heston played men who changed the world, but wrestled with the world changing him. In that tension, he saw the quiet roots of a prejudice shaped not by hatred, but by the fear that a new Hollywood might leave certain legends behind. After hearing stories about actors whose contradictions were loud and impossible to miss, Blocker eventually arrived at a figure whose influence was far more subtle, and perhaps because of that, far more enduring. Fred Astaire, with his impeccable tuxedos, featherlight footwork, and unshakable poise, embodied refinement in a way no other performer of his generation could match. His artistry transcended genre, era, and cultural boundaries. Yet the conversations Blocker had with choreographers, archivists, and former studio personnel revealed a quieter truth. Elegance, when left unexamined, can become a filter that narrows who is allowed to share the spotlight. Several dance historians recounted that Astaire's famous tribute number in Swing Time, performed in blackface, was often defended by the studios as a product of its era. But what concerned those who worked around him was not that single choice, it was the pattern that followed. Choreographers who collaborated with Astaire on later productions described him as deeply invested in aesthetic cohesion, often requesting ensembles that matched the visual palette he imagined. These requests were framed as artistic guidance, but according to one assistant choreographer who spoke with Blocker, they frequently resulted in the exclusion of dancers of color who, despite their talent, didn't fit the look Astaire wanted. Blocker also learned from a former casting associate that Astaire had a preference for working within creative environments that felt familiar and controlled. While he never issued explicit instructions to limit diversity, his quiet insistence on certain tones or balances meant that directors and producers often preemptively avoided bringing more varied performers into his orbit. These decisions were rarely questioned. After all, Astaire was considered the standard of sophistication, and sophistication in Hollywood at the time carried an unspoken association with whiteness. To Blocker, Astaire's story illustrated a form of prejudice that rarely surfaces in public debates. Not overt rejection, but the accumulation of countless small choices that keep opportunities confined to those who resemble the past. He saw Astaire not as a malicious figure, but as someone whose pursuit of perfection inadvertently reinforced the narrow boundaries of the industry. Blocker later remarked that Astaire never slammed doors, he simply preferred them half-closed. And in Hollywood, even a half-closed door could shape decades of representation. By the time Blocker reached the final name on the list, he realized that the most unsettling revelations were not always attached to the loudest or most forceful personalities. Some shadows emerged from people the public trusted most, those whose cultural presence felt comforting, almost familial. Bing Crosby was such a figure. His voice carried through living rooms every Christmas, wrapping itself around generations like a blanket of nostalgia. He was the sound of calm, tradition, and gentle reassurance. Yet the accounts Blocker gathered from musicians, club staff, and even members of Crosby's own social circle revealed a man whose warmth, so palpable in his music, faded into something more distant and reserved behind closed doors. A former bandleader who worked with Crosby during radio days recalled that the singer maintained an almost impenetrable emotional barrier. He was courteous, professional, and never openly hostile, but carried a stiffness that subtly shaped the atmosphere around him. According to the bandleader, Crosby adhered strictly to certain social norms of his upbringing, norms that segregated members of the entertainment world into categories of familiar and other. The bandleader emphasized that Crosby never voiced discriminatory views aloud, yet his body language and conversational avoidance created a divide felt by performers who did not fit the traditional mold of Hollywood's upper social tiers. Blocker also spoke with a longtime employee of an exclusive country club Crosby frequented. Membership rules were never formally written, but everyone understood the quiet expectations. Expectations Crosby, like many of his peers, accepted without challenge. The employee remembered that Crosby seemed comfortable within these boundaries, neither enforcing them nor questioning them, allowing the unspoken restrictions to persist simply because they maintained the world he already knew. It was not active prejudice, the employee insisted, but a passive acceptance of structures that had existed long before Crosby gained fame. For Blocker, this passivity carried its own weight. He believed Crosby's influence made his silence more powerful than outright disapproval from others. A man whose music symbolized unity and warmth had, perhaps unintentionally, preserved social divides by never pushing against them. Blocker summarized it quietly. Bing didn't build the walls, but he never tried to see over them. In that stillness, he embodied a form of prejudice shaped not by intention, but by comfort. An ending that revealed how Hollywood's brightest lights could cast shadows even when they believed they stood in the sun. As Blocker reflected on the stories behind these 10 legends, he realized that Hollywood's golden age was shaped as much by its shadows as by its brilliance. None of the names on his list were defined by outright hostility. Instead, their influence came through countless subtle choices, quiet hesitations, and unexamined beliefs that shaped the opportunities of others in ways they never fully acknowledged. What struck him was not hypocrisy, but the distance between the public images the world adored and the private instincts that guided decisions behind closed doors. Blocker believed that understanding these contradictions did not erase their achievements, but revealed the complex humanity beneath their polished mythologies. He saw that the industry they helped build was constructed not only by talent and ambition, but also by the invisible boundaries they reinforced, sometimes without realizing it. To him, their stories served as a reminder that even icons can unintentionally limit the world around them. And so Blocker posed one final question. If the brightest stars of Hollywood carried shadows they never confronted, what else remains hidden beneath the legends we celebrate? Stay with us, because the next chapter uncovers another truth Hollywood never intended to reveal.